Eero Saarinen was a visionary, an architect who not only saw the future, but who literally defined the shape of its buildings and the form of its furniture. From his airports in the United States and embassies in Europe, to his iconic tulip and womb chairs, his designs captured the aspirations and values of mid-20th century America. While this is an international story, it is one that unfolds here in Michigan with Cranbrook at its center. My name is Greg Wittkopp, and I'm the director of the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. Joining me for a conversation today about Eero Saarinen and the new film about his life and his career are three of my colleagues here at Cranbrook. Leslie Edwards, our head archivist, Andrew Blauvelt, director of Cranbrook Academy of Art, and Scott Klinker, designer in residence and head of the 3D design department at Cranbrook Academy of Art. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Cranbrook was founded by Detroit newspaper publishers George and Ellen Booth in 1904. Although it started as their country estate, by the time the Saarinen family arrived in the United States in the 1920s, it was evolving into the world-renowned educational community that it is today. A place that includes a pre-kindergarten through 12th grade school system, an Institute of Science, an Academy of Art, and a contemporary art museum. Eero's father, Eero Saarinen, was hired by George Booth to shape the Academy of Art. And then as resident architect, also designed most of Cranbrook's original buildings. Realizing the talent of his young and precocious son, Eero allowed his son to design many of the original decorative elements for the buildings. These included ceramic tiles, iron gates, bronze inserts for some of the furniture in the dining hall, and decorative carved stone details. But it was in the building that we are in today, the original Kingswood School for Girls, that Eero had his first major commission. Now imagine being a young 19, 20-year-old kid and being asked by a wealthy newspaperman and your father to design every single piece of furniture for a new high school. That is a commission that Eero Saarinen received in 1930 and 1931. And like young designers everywhere, he was inspired by everything, from the furniture that had been discovered in King Tut's tomb to the radical modern designs that were coming out of the Bauhaus in Germany. Here in the dining hall, he was looking at 19th century neoclassical designs from Scandinavia. While it is a far cry from the furniture that would mark his design as a mature designer, this is where he was allowed to experiment and try out new ideas. As we sit in this magnificent dining hall, I am reminded of some of the other talents that attended Cranbrook, including a young woman that studied here at Kingswood, Florence Schuss-Knoll, who with her husband Hans Knoll shaped Knoll International into one of the most important furniture companies of the 20th and 21st centuries. Indeed, Cranbrook has rightfully been called the cradle of American modernism, a place where many of the designers that shaped what we now call mid-century modernism began their careers. Leslie, let me start this conversation by asking you what Cranbrook was like in the 1930s when Eero was working here with his father as an architect.
Well, the late 1930s was a hotbed of experimentation and collaboration. Through Eero Saarinen, contemporary architects like Frank Lloyd Wright and Alvar Aalto visited the campus and met with the students for informal conversations. In 1938, the roster included architects and designers like Benjamin Baldwin, who had studied at Princeton with Jean Labatut and painting with the abstract expressionist Hans Hofmann. Harry Weiss had studied at MIT and Yale, and he won a fellowship here to study with Eero Saarinen and shared a drafting table with Ralph Rapson. Rapson was a Michigan native, and he came out of University of Michigan. Ralph won numerous architecture competitions for his innovative designs. Charlie Eames had first studied under Eero for 1 year here in the architecture department, and then became the first instructor of the design department from 1939 to 1940. Meanwhile, Marian Strangel was also experimenting with new fibers like rayon, cellophane, and fiberglass, and Harry Batoya was experimenting with new technologies like spinning metal. All of these individuals went on to become well-known modernist designers.
But I dare say the story of design here at Cranbrook probably didn't end when Charles and Ray Eames moved to California. So I'm wondering if, Andrew, if you could tell us a little bit about what was going on in the design department here during the second half of the 20th century and who some of the thought leaders were.
Sure. Well, a lot of people do believe that, design sort of ended with its kind of birth of what we now call mid-century modernism, which really took place in the 30s, right? In America, it takes a long time for ideas to really come into the fore in terms of the mainstream. But there are many people, important designers that came afterwards or shortly thereafter. So like in the 1950s, someone like Niels Diffrient, who was a student here, would be developed into a world-famous furniture designer. He had major contributions beyond just making objects, though. So he introduced, along with a couple other industrial designers, the notion of human factors, what we can now call ergonomics, into the design thinking process, the design methods process. You had people like Ken Isaacs, who was here as a student in the late 1950s, ran the department for about a year. He was introducing ideas of modularity, prefabrication, to the whole process through his living structures. That was kind of his thesis project that evolved later with technology. So both within Niels Diffrient and Ken Isaacs, you see this movement towards the user, what we call the user in the design process. So it's not about creating just a beautiful sculptural form. It would be informed by those people using those kinds of objects, the person in the chair, the age of that person in the chair, their height, their weight. And that same idea behind the user would then evolve in the 1980s and 70s and 80s when Catherine and Michael McCoy became heads of the design department. At that time, it was both graphic design or two-dimensional design and product design or three-dimensional design as one unit. So there was a lot of crossing back and forth of ideas about communication and meaning, the meaning of a poster, but also the meaning of a piece of furniture. So they developed a lot of important projects with their students. So students like Lisa Krohn would develop her famous phone book answering machine, which looked, again, this was the 1980s before smartphones and cell phones. So looking at the problems of how do you receive messages and how do you communicate that. She used the metaphor of a book and turning pages in a book to activate different functions to help clarify how consumer goods would be used by ordinary people. Then it all comes full circle, I think, when looking at maybe Mike McCoy and Peter Stathis, who was here as the head of industrial design in the mid to late 1990s. They together developed a new product called Horizon Light. It's one of the first flat LED light systems together jointly. So you have the student working with his former instructor, both after Cranbrook, interestingly, developed a new kind of product related to new technology in a very sinuous form that wouldn't be that different than maybe what Eero Saarinen would have designed had he lived into the present day.
So it's been over 85 years since Eero Saarinen began his career here at Cranbrook and designed these chairs that we're sitting in right now. Scott, I'm wondering if you can maybe bring us up to the moment and tell us if the career and work of Eero Saarinen still informs the work of the young graduate students that you work with at Cranbrook today.
Well, absolutely, and in different ways. I think we've learned so much from the example set by Eero and all his contemporaries, and I think it's safe to say that in architecture and design that they practiced in a way that was could be considered close to an art form. But I think we can learn also by looking at how they got there, and I think a lot of that has to do with Cranbrook. I think Eero's career really is a sort of living proof of the power of Cranbrook's educational model. He was a hybrid thinker who could integrate architectural thinking, engineering thinking, and sculptural thinking into a resolved direction. And I think that kind of hybridity is really built into the DNA of Cranbrook. In a way, Cranbrook has been this grand experiment over time. So think about it. We have 150 students in 10 different disciplines, working in a studio environment. It's a pressure cooker, incubator space, and we're gonna give them a bit more freedom. And then we're gonna set up this experiment and see what happens. we've learned what happens. We get people like Eero Saarinen. He and his contemporaries were some of the first generation of people to kind of experience that educational model, and it creates people who can think in a more expansive way about the design process and kind of integrate the thinking from other fields to make design, architecture, and art smarter, more creative, and more visionary. And I think he's kind of the perfect example of that.
Scott's designer in residence and lives on the campus, has a studio on the campus,
Right.
is really working side by side with his students. I mean, we don't call you a faculty member here. We call you a designer in residence. So it is this model of peers. The fact that I think
it's more peer-like now than it was, though, don't you think?
Well, but you even think about somebody like Charles Eames. He had already been practicing architecture in St. Louis before he even came to Cranbrook. You know, these weren't people that were learning from scratch. They were really coming here to really advance the ideas that they had already been developing, and this gave them that space that they needed.
But then he comes to Cranbrook and spends a lot of his time doing ceramics and film.
This is true.
And I think that's the beauty of Cranbrook, especially at the scale that we're at, that it's that kind of cross-pollination between between disciplines that makes this a kind of magic happen. That's why I came here. And I think it shows up in all of these great people who we admire that have come out of here, like Eero and Charles and Ray and Bertoya, Noel. All of them, I think, benefited so much from that. And that's what made them great designers, that they came here and were influenced by, especially by craft. Mm-hmm. That's what really took their work to another level.
Cranbrook itself doesn't change much, right? It's a work of art in and of itself, the campus, and that's the power of design. It totally influences how you think about things. When you have to sit in a chair in this room every day for lunch, you're bound to learn something, even if you don't think about it until maybe 20 years later as a student. You're forced to do that at the Art Academy, is to pay attention to all of these things. And that can't help but have a profound impact on how you think about the world itself, and that's probably why Cranbrook has produced so many significant architects, artists, craftspeople, and designers over the decades, is because of that fundamental lesson.